All right, I'm going to be coughing. I have a cough. I have a cold. It's not coronavirus. It's not COVID-19. I promise. Although I guess you don't have to worry online. But um, I've got a cold working its way through my whole family, so I'm the latest one to get it. So I might cough a little bit. Let me know if I start coughing and it's too loud and it blows out your speakers or something. It should be okay. I'll do it away from the microphone. Let me find my screen. I want it. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'll give it one more minute, and since y'all are here, like I'll do it anyway. I'm recording this, so anyone who's not here, I'll just send a message saying that it'll be on. I'll post this video online. Okay. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen. Uh, okay. Okay, can y'all see my screen? Yeah? Okay. Should be good. Um, okay, so I'm sharing the screen. All right, so yeah, let's go start. It's not, yeah, I, just because of the situation, like you're not getting the full, it's a little, everything is pared down a little bit. So I didn't talk as much about Anzal Dua as I wanted to. But hopefully you got a chance to look at Performing the Border, which the link is in the syllabus. Performing the Border fits really well with Anzal Dua because they're both about border identities and about people that live in the margins between official identities, between nationalisms, between official languages. What is it like to be a person suspended in these places? And so, so Performing the Border is like a really good example of how those situations can do violence. In that case, literal violence to people who aren't in official, who don't occupy official categories and things. And so you can take those same ideas, you can apply them to sexuality, you can apply them to racial and ethnic identities, you can apply them to a lot of different places, and it plays out differently. But what those situations have in common in terms of border identities is that it just tears you in different directions. You're not recognized as legitimate in either of in any of the categories, um, and in a lot of cases we make people, you know it. Well, okay, let me back up. Performing the Border is also like a really good example of the things I was talking about with post-structuralism, with Foucault, and all these things about subjects being made. So the the fact that these areas that they work in don't belong to Mexico or the U.S. These maquiladoras are like these post-national spaces where labor laws and things like that don't apply. Um, it produces them as these flexible, piecemeal, remixable parts. Right, it takes away their humanity in a lot of ways, and so what the filmmaker is arguing is that the serial killer is performing this. It's kind of illustrating this, that you don't matter. You're just your body parts. So it doesn't even matter. Yeah, so I'm going to remix them and just kind of illustrate that. So again, that's kind of I don't totally buy all of that. It's a very psychological explanation, so we don't really get into that in Anthro. But um, the documentary that accompanied, that's the news part of it, the true crime element does kind of illustrate some of the things that we talk about with border identities. And so I'd hope you get it. We'll talk about that more. I'll relate them together. Midterm 3 has a couple of questions that kind of relate them. And so I'll give everyone a chance to, explore that in the third midterm. I will grade the second midterms this week. Look for that online. Okay, so since we're already like one class behind on the syllabus, I'll go ahead and do this as long as my voice lasts. I think I can hang in there for about 45 minutes. We won't go until 12:15. Um, we won't go until 12:15. But I wanted to introduce you to Belsdorf's work, Coming of Age and Second Life. On the syllabus, and this may be why some people aren't here today. I did say that today, the assignment for today was basically to watch the film Life 2.0. It's on Netflix and it's also on YouTube. They're a little bit different. I think the YouTube version seems to be edited down a little bit, but it's fine. Either one is okay. It actually doesn't need to be a 90-minute film. It could easily be done in an hour, but it does give you some examples of what he's talking about, and it gives us some more ethnographic data to discuss his theory, because his book has a lot of theory. And so basically what I wanted to do today was just walk you through his main points. And there's really not a whole lot of main points. Belsdorf was a classmate of mine. Tom Belsdorf was a classmate of mine in grad school at Stanford. And he's actually at UC Irvine. He's the chair of anthropology at UC Irvine now. And he's come up and give talks sometimes and things like that. But he uses a million words to say something that could be said in 100 sometimes. That's kind of the Stanford style. I don't do it, but most of my classmates, that's just kind of how they are. So don't be intimidated by some of the quotes that I'm going to pull here, because in the end, he's not saying something super radical or complicated, but he just has a roundabout way of coming to it. So what I'm going to try to do with these slides is just kind of boil down what's his argument, because it does get a little dense sometimes. But the ideas are valid. The ideas are really productive. And especially now, right now, when everyone's living virtual, like classes, education is all, virtual now. Like even work, the world of work, socially, people are dating through Zoom now. I've heard, like, you can meet people online, and you can meet people on Tinder, and then they, date virtually through Zoom or something during the shutdown. So these ideas about how human behavior is mediated through technology is a really popular topic. And in fact, yesterday I saw a news article about a book that's going to come out. I'm actually going to buy it. I can't wait to read it. It sounds really interesting. A journalist wrote a book about Instagram that just came out. So Belsdorf's book is about Second Life. There's a new book. It's called No Filter. It came out this week. It's about the decisions that went into the design elements of Instagram and how that has influenced human behavior and how we relate to each other, and how that shaped online culture. And a lot of it, some of it is just the personalities of the programmers. Some of it, Facebook, same thing with Zuckerberg and Facebook. A lot of the decisions that go into the shape of the platform, it really has a huge impact on how we relate to each other. And so this book called No Filter that just came out this week talks about some of the design elements of Instagram, and how, it didn't have to be this whole idea of filters and things. And what the book argues is that Instagram didn't have to end up the way it did. And so, but people have adapted to what exists there. So this whole idea of influencers and presenting this perfect life and having these amazing photos, that wasn't the original intent, but it's kind of become that. And it's gotten to the point where the company has reached out to their influencers to ask them to be more real and vulnerable, like stop looking so perfect because it's freaking people out. Like, because psychologists are telling them, like, yo, y'all are depressing everybody. Be more real, right? So it's kind of like even that's manufactured, right? So, okay, so some of these ideas that Belsdorf talks about are even more valid now, and you can transfer some of them to talking about social media also. Okay, so and so what you're going to see, take a look at Belsdorf's the couple of chapters I gave you. Life 2.0 is about the day in the life of several Second Life regulars. So you see some elements of romance. You see a couple, two people who are married. Two other people hook up on Second Life, and then they try it in the real world, and you get a good comparison about how their relationship changes. You got identity issues. There's a guy in the film, a guy who plays Second Life as a 12-year-old girl, and no one in his life understands why he does this. And so you kind of learn about why would he do this, and he takes it very seriously, as we get into later. And Belzer's intro talks about how the reality of the virtual commerce. There's a woman who does architecture and fashion and builds things for people, and there's drama involved in that too. She makes a lot of money doing it, but there's also drama involved in it. But overall, he talks about, his basic argument, if you want to boil it down to its root elements, is basically that people do things in virtual worlds. They do the same things, it's the same stuff that we do in the real world, right? Um, so a lot of, oops, I just hit my mouse by accident. So a lot of the elements, a lot of the things, a lot of the biases that social scientists have had up until very recently against doing field work in virtual areas is that, oh, people just rip people off, or they're just trying to hook up, or you're not meeting the real person. And while he's arguing, he's like, yeah, you are meeting the real person, but it's the real person as in as it exists in the virtual world, and this is a place that we need to take seriously. I don't think anyone would argue with that now, but back when he published his book in 2006, yeah, that was kind of a radical idea. That was that was a fairly radical. Well, maybe it's 2008, whatever the year of the book is. That was kind of a radical idea because no one was doing that before this book, and so Second Life is kind of dead now. I think it's down. I think at its peak it had 3 million players or inhabitants or something. I think it's down to 10,000 now if it exists at all. But they're creating a new version of this. I think it's already out in VR. VR. A lot of virtual reality companies are experimenting with things like this. So he asked the question: how could this be seen just as real as life in real life? Like how? And so he's going to explain how should anthropologists deal with these spaces, right? Okay, and so that's the film. The book is entirely inside the virtual world of Second Life. I mean, he does interview some of the engineers and programmers, and because you do have to understand the technology, you do need to understand the business model of these companies, but he wants to study Second Life on its own terms, and so he does not meet the people that he interviews with his fieldwork for the book. He does not meet them in real life, and that's kind of that's kind of a debate within this field of virtual ethnography. Is that, do you need to meet them offline or not? He's on the side of, no, I don't, because this is a real space that I'm meeting these people in. Some people would say that, yeah, you need to meet them offline. So there's a valid argument to go either way. That's just kind of the stance he takes here. And so he also uses this to interrogate, what he says, interrogate anthropology as a project. What are we doing? Like, what? Should we just ignore this place? Should we treat them as video games? Or is this just escapism like drugs? And he's going to say, no, it's not. This is not escapism. This is real life, right? And so, and he uses this term as Second Life as another example of Homo faber, like humans as makers. And and there's a later slide about this, I have a quote, but what he's saying is that the spaces that we occupy in virtual areas are constructed. They are made by humans, so that makes them artificial in some ways. But the lives we occupy in the real world are also made by humans, right? When you go into a school, a church, a house, a park, like most of the places we inhabit in our real world lives are also made by humans. And geographers and anthropologists have been looking for 100 years now. We've been looking at the ways that spaces impact behavior. Some of the post-structuralists look at, if we had stayed in person, I would have done a whole lecture about space and behavior and space and identity. Like your No Logo, the Naomi Klein's film and book, No Logo, talks about, that's why she talks about space so much. So many of the spaces we occupy are designed for consumerism and capitalism. Like, where do we, and the places that are not designed for capitalism are just constantly shrinking. And so that matters. And so spaces in the real world are made by people, spaces in the virtual world are made by people. And so that's one of his big points here. So what are virtual worlds? And there's more to come about this later. But virtual worlds are places inhabited by persons enabled by online technologies. All right. Okay, so hold on 1 second here. All right. So that's fine. All right. Their virtual worlds are places inhabited by persons enabled by online technologies. So he starts. He does a lot. The thing about Bellsdorf's background is that he has a background in linguistics. So he does a lot. In a lot of his writings, he likes to define terms, right? So before he jumps into all of the different chapters, he spends a big chunk of the intro chapter. He spends a big chunk of the intro chapter defining terms, right, so that you can discuss them later. And I think it's productive. It's a good thing to do so that you know what he means by the terms. And um, so he starts out, say 17 here. This is where the quote starts, but there's a lot. He talks about his entry into it and how he discovered Second Life and what you can do in it. He spends a lot before he gets to this point in the intro. He's kind of explaining what Second Life is. So if you're familiar with these kinds of worlds, if you've ever played Roblox, you know how this works, like whatever. So you can skim through that part. But so he starts to talk about how the real world of human social life is also synthesized through human artifice. So this is basically what I was just saying, that the world we live in our everyday lives offline is just as constructed as the things that we recognize as virtual. Virtual worlds are self-evidently social constructions, but they're far from unique in this regard. And at this point, he also makes another point, which is kind of a big thing in Anthro. This is a big theory point in Anthro over the last 10 years or so, that world is a dangerously naturalistic metaphor. It implies an entity that has come into being without human agency and that is self-contained, without boundaries. You can walk around the world and end up back where you started. Okay, so he cites another classmate of mine, Mei Zhan at UC Irvine, kind of popularized this term called worlding. You don't have to worry about that. He does mention it in the book. But what that refers to, what he's talking about here, is that this assumption that the worlds we live in would exist without human activity is false for contemporary cultural anthropology, right? And it's kind of become the mainstream now that, you have to look at, it's always in process. Even these spaces that we think are just pre-made and don't affect you, well, it's the things that you do in the spaces that make them real, right? So he said there is no objective, static, unchanging world out there in terms of human perception, right? There's nothing out there that we don't influence by the things that we all collectively do together. So there is no perspective, and this is a very postmodern thing to say. There is no perspective from which you can watch objectively. You can observe human behavior objectively. There is no fixed point, right? So the world, as we think of it doesn't pre-exist human behavior and observation and things. So everything you watch is creating the world around you. The world around you doesn't just exist in a vacuum. You have to watch what people do to understand it. I hope that makes sense. And you can raise your hand, or you can raise your hand and cut me off, just like if we were in class or something, if something doesn't make sense. And so that's an important concept for understanding virtual worlds, because even Second Life, it doesn't just exist. What it is being constantly created by the things people do in it, right? So you can't just step outside of Second Life and say, oh, this is what it is. Well, now let's look at the people. No, it's a combination. You can only understand it in terms of what people do there. So, okay. So again, he's defining terms, the virtual, the actual gap. Okay. So he's talking about the digital here. And so one of the things, the virtual and the actual are not reducible to each other, even in their mutual constitution. One goal of this book's analysis is to argue for a rehabilitation and refinement of virtual. There are distinct cultures in virtual worlds. There do exist distinct cultures in virtual worlds, even though they draw from actual world cultures. So he's saying that virtual worlds do exist in their own right, even though they do overlap with the offline world, right? So these things do, and in fact, he's going to say that, he's going to argue that you can't understand one without the other. So when it comes to these people, you wouldn't even be able to really know them in the real world without understanding what they do in the virtual world. And so and he talks about this gap between them that needs to exist for either one of them to function. So they can't function in the real world without the virtual, and they can't function in the virtual world without the real. So it sounds a little confusing, but basically saying that gap is what's so important about it. That gap is a border between offline and online, and what you and I'll say it right here just so that you can have a little thumbtack, a little post-it note on it. This is what you see. I do have an example. One of the midterm questions about this is about the look at the romantic couple, the two married people that hook up on Inside Circle Second Life. Watch what happens when they meet each other in the real world. It kind of works for a while, but you kind of see. I don't want to spoil too much of it, but it's what you're seeing there is the breakdown of the gap. All right, they got along much better when they were just two people hooking up online, but when they actually try to merge their worlds together, it kind of falls apart. Right, so. Okay, so I'll get back to the gap in the next slide. But and I put a little note at the bottom. This connects with Marcus and Fisher's focus on postmodern ethnography, on ethnographies or fictions. That's not really important right now, but so there's this idea in cultural anthropology that ethnographies are fictions, right? Made with collaboratively by people rather than empirical records of an objective truth. Okay, so. All right. So he's not documenting, his production of this ethnography is a creative fiction. So fiction in its original intent, which does not mean it's fake. It just means that it's created, right? So, okay, it's a creative endeavor. Okay. Okay, so that's what I just said. Once the gap collapses with the couple, and clutter is not an issue in Second Life. You just file everything away in an inventory. One of the people in the documentary say this, right? That life is more complicated because you can't just put things in an inventory. They actually have to bring all their stuff with them, right? So, so virtual. He defines it as it can be understood in terms of potentiality. It can be said to exist wherever there's a perceived gap between experience and the actual. So now the most important meaning of virtual connotes approaching the actual without arriving there. So he's writing against this idea that virtual indicates something that's not real, or it's less real than reality, right? So he's saying that we need a new understanding of what virtual is. Virtual is just something that's created. These virtual worlds are just something that's created by people. That it's not. It doesn't mean it's fake. It doesn't mean it's less real than the real world. It's real. It's just different, right? And so it's still just people. So this gap between virtual and actual is critical. Were it to be filled in, there would be no virtual worlds, and in a sense, no actual world either. And okay, so what does that mean? What do you mean to say that how can you say that there's no virtual world? How can you say that there's no real world without virtual worlds? Well, he expands on that, and I don't have it here in slides, but what that refers to is his idea, which I've always believed, even before I read this book, is that humans already exist in virtual worlds. That's what culture kind of is, right? You have the world of material. You have the material world, and then you have the ideological and cultural world. And we already live inside these matrices, to use the matrix as a metaphor, right? We already live in these areas, and so we've already done that before. And so anthropologists have developed tools for understanding the virtual worlds that humans occupy, right? So there's nothing radically new about that here. And so he's saying that we can treat these virtual worlds the same way we've been treating social networks like kinship and culture, other aspects of culture like religion and things like that. So it's really a fallacy to understand the virtual as fake, right, or as just artificial. And so the actual virtual is a reflection of the nature-culture binary. It is incorrect to associate virtual with cultural and actual with nature. Humans make culture in a virtual and actual context, since humans are part of nature and the virtual is a product of human intentionality. The virtual is as natural as anything humans do in the actual world, right? So if that makes sense, it's kind of a long logic. Excuse me. So he's saying that the virtual is as natural as anything humans do in the actual world. So because it's something that people make. So homo faber, right? Um, so in the end, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but online worlds are not spaces in which we simply work out offline issues and once sorted happily leave. What happens in virtual worlds often is just as real, just as meaningful to participants. And you see this in the film. Like, this is very real to these people. It's not a video game, right? And so what can we do as anthropologists to try to understand what people do in these kinds of places? Um, so the virtual, as you read it, the virtual is opposed not to the real, but to the actual. The virtual is fully real insofar as it is virtual. The virtual must be defined as strictly a part of the real object. So he doesn't oppose virtual and real. I refer to places of human culture not. He refers to offline things as the actual world. Actual is also imperfect, but I find it the best provisional term, and it's the one that they use. So actual, so it's real is a really. He's saying that virtual versus real is a bad way to think about it. Better would be virtual versus actual, right? So because they're both real. So virtual is real, actual is real. Let's get away from so the term real is kind of useless here, right? So he tries not to refer to it as real world. He calls it actual world. Okay, so here's the part where he's talking about everything that humans do. You know, every field, every social space, every physical space that we occupy is also real. So we need to understand it. So he's saying that virtual and actual, both places of homo faber, the human as maker. We've made all of these places. So, and he talks about the age of techne is his term. It never caught on, but what he means by it is that he's saying that the information age has become this age of techne. And actually, I think it's more, it may have just been ahead of its time because I think more people would agree with this now. This book was written before Facebook was really Facebook. I think Facebook existed when this book was written, but it wasn't huge yet. Facebook, Instagram, and Google have kind of taken over the world. And so what he's saying is that anthropology needs to understand how these technologies are affecting how we live and who we are and how we identify. And this is me at the bottom. I'm saying that techne refers to how aspects of human life are mediated by technology. They're mutually constituted. Humans make the technologies, but technologies often shape the way humans relate to each other. And so virtual realms, there's really nothing entirely new about them, but yeah, we do need to start thinking about how these technologies shape even offline or actual life, right? So, and that's why I mentioned that book about Instagram, the book No Filter, that just came out. That's why I'm excited to read it, because I'm wondering what ideas people are coming up with for understanding social media, right? So people made the technology makes people, and it just kind of goes in a circle, right? So Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat are like really good places to look at that. You know, people change who they are based on these technologies, and it's kind of scary. Okay. Much research on virtual is predicated on cultural that if a boundary is transgressed. Okay, so he's saying, so here we're back, this kind of touches on boundary identities, right? He's saying that a lot of assumptions about virtual research in virtual worlds is this idea that, well, these people, they meet each other offline, and that boundary between actual and virtual gets crossed all the time. He's saying, yeah, that's kind of what makes it. That's what makes them both stronger. It demonstrates that crossing a boundary can strengthen the distinctiveness of the two domains it demarcates. So you can see this in Anzaldua's work, right? Crossing, border identities kind of undermine their own power sometimes by making the other two stronger. But that's not a huge point to make. That's kind of a and so he's talking about another massive transformation linked to technology. The creation of societies on the internet. We have more places to socialize with other people, and that's true. I mean, I've already talked about that. And so another part of the intro, he writes about two negative assumptions that people talk about when they hear about this research. The first is that virtuals are hopelessly contaminated by capitalism, and he talks about that. he talks about that. He's like, oh, everyone's just there to make money. Well, most places you go as an anthropologist, that's true also offline. That's true in the actual world too. And in fact, he says he compares it to when he did research on homosexuality in Indonesia, was his original topic. He talks about, it was like, so people would say that, oh, people just want to hook up and all these things. Like, well, yeah, that's what humans do. And so, and Indonesia is a capitalist country too, so I shouldn't go there because they practice capitalism, and so, that was one of the things. And I think that has changed recently, but it was something he was dealing with when he was coming up with the project. I had a similar thing happen to me when I was doing my dissertation fieldwork in Taipei, Taiwan. And people would always say that there's no culture in Taipei. They would say that you need to see real Taiwanese culture. You have to go out to the countryside or somewhere like that. Um, just because Taipei is a big city and it's not pure, culture is not pure here and all this other stuff. It's all contaminated. It's kind of the silliness of people trying to design, research projects in a place where, there never have been any pure cultures out there. And, culture in villages in Taipei are just as global as culture is in Taipei, so it just looks different. So, he's dealing with some of the same things and doing virtual research. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to skip down. Avoiding narratives of dystopia or utopia and discussing virtual worlds is a challenge. And basically what he's saying here is when social scientists when social scientists talk about technology, it's always usually wildly positive or wildly negative. And so he's saying we need to get away from this thing. I've had several students do research on video gaming, people who play video games, some professionally and some just as a hobby. And usually people, when they talk to people about their research, it always, people's responses are usually like, oh, I heard about that couple in Korea, in South Korea, that, got so obsessed with their virtual baby that their real baby in the real world, in the actual world, starved to death. And that's true. It was a news story. And there are extreme versions of people who get addicted to video games and things. But, again, that's true of things that are purely in the actual world too. There are people who get so addicted to skateboarding that that it ruins their lives, or people who get addicted to alcohol or anything. There are humans who can be addicted to anything. There's no more higher prevalence of this kind of stuff in virtual worlds than there are in the actual world. So, the internet's going to save us all, and it's going to make it so that people don't have to be depressed anymore because they can find people. Yeah, okay, that's extreme too. Like Facebook does a lot of positive things, but also does a lot of negative things. Again, just like any technology that humans make, any spaces that humans build, there's always going to be a positive aspect and negative aspect. So we don't worry. We try not to get into either extreme. And so, again, he's setting up his project here. So is it creating a new kind of humanity? No, his answer to that. And that's debatable. I think I have a midterm question about that. Here, are these technologies going to lead to the emergence of a new form of humanity? He's saying that I argue that it is in being virtual that we are human. Virtual worlds reconfigure selfhood and sociality, and there are chapters about that. But this is only possible because they rework the virtuality that characterizes human beings in the actual world. So that's a dense sentence, but what he's saying is virtual worlds do change how we identify. They do change how we relate to each other. And I would say the same thing with social media. But this is only possible because they rework the virtuality that we already have, right? So I hope that makes sense. So they do change the way our identities, and they do change our social networks, but it's only because we already had these virtual social networks to begin with. Selfhood is how you identify in relation to other people. Sociality is just how we form connections to other people. And what these technologies do is just change that. They don't. So it's not radically altering humanity. It's just it's altering the way that we tweak these things that we already had that were already virtual, right? So there's nothing qualitatively new about virtual worlds except for the technology. So I hope that makes sense. And that's kind of a big point for his book, that no, we're not going to all just step into we're not just all going to step into these virtual worlds like Lawnmower Man or Ghost in the Shell and just disappear into virtuality and forget about our bodies. No, our bodies still exist. We still have needs. We're still animals. We still rip each other off. We still hook up with people. We still have sex. We still have religion. We still do all these other things that humans do. But these technologies are going to bring about some changes in that. And so, again, there's nothing new about technology. This is just a new technology, right? So, okay. So why are virtual spaces important? Okay. So these are some terms you might want to be familiar with. These are some terms you might want to be familiar with as you go through his reading. Public sphere. It's a field in which human interactions take place. It's where power is exercised, right, between people. It's where hegemony is secured. It's where it's resisted. It's where communities are formed. And public sphere is what Klein was bemoaning in No Logo, that it's shrinking. Like the public sphere is kind of shrinking because everything is becoming private space. Even the places where we try to organize for politics and resistance and try to make our lives better places, it's becoming increasingly virtual, like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Signal for something encrypted, right? Places like Second Life. Okay, so that's the public spheres where ideas are debated. Public spaces, the actual physical locations in which the public sphere unfolds. And No Logo, so you looked at how these are shrinking in the context of neoliberalism. Spaces are being transformed into semi-public and private spaces, which foster subjectivities increasingly for the market rather than for the community. So these spaces that we occupy, as they become increasingly marketized, like where our lives are being subsumed by this market, right? Okay, so that's what a lot of this is about. And so I would argue that maybe even virtual, a lot of the virtual spaces that Belsdorff is talking about is just an extension of these public spaces, and they're not as public as you think they are, right? As they may feel sometimes. Okay, so spatiality. And spatiality, that's a term I would have lectured about if we hadn't broken up and lost a couple of weeks, but so I cut this lecture out. But it's how anthropologists and geographers look at how space is empty and it becomes place or something meaningful through intentional human activity. Whether any given space will foster community or market, or the market, capitalism, right, depends on which of the main players prevails, community or capitalism. And they're just constantly butting heads with each other. So it's kind of a big deal in geography, also in anthropology. And so that's what we're looking at here with Second Life. It's this technology creates an empty space, but then it only takes on meanings in the ways that people use it, right? So, okay. Okay, so what is this? Okay, so you can pause the video if you're looking at this not live, just to get a gist of these. I've talked about the first part, so I cite Ready Player One here. Have y'all seen Ready Player One before? That's actually a good way. That's a good place to explore this. I would suggest. I think the book is better than the movie, but I cite it here just because anthropology has had to adjust to a transformed world since the late 20th century, where technology, more and more of our behavior is mediated through technology. So all of these tools that we develop for investigating identity, community, sociality, et cetera, need to be transformed as well. So how do we do this in late modernity? A more interconnected world. Well, Belsdorff is trying to give us the tools for that. He's trying to say that as more of our lives become mediated by technology, how does anthropology need to adjust? Okay. Okay. And so here I'm trying to make the connection between something you've seen before. Apataurei's work can help us understand, because the spaces are different and personal identities are multiple, contradictory, sometimes ironic and skewed. This is what Apataurai talked about with globalization. Well, this can some of these ideas can be applied to virtual spaces as well. So He talks about how people can be themselves. Belsdorf talks about how people can be themselves even more so than in the actual world. And so this doesn't mean that they're performing. It doesn't mean that they're just making up something new. Um, it can refer, what he's referring to is that maybe people's online personas are revealing something about them that was already there. So it's not like they're just making up new characters. It's that maybe this new space allows new things for them. What are you doing over there? What are you doing? Okay. That's okay. Sorry. But, all right. Okay, so I'm not going to go back to Appadurai. I will flip through these so that if you go back and look at the video that I post on Beachboard of this lecture, and maybe I'll just post this whole slideshow or link to it because it's on Google Slides. So I try to relate, this would be the other 45 minutes of this lecture, but I'm going to cut it off here. But remember the scapes from Appadurai. So I'm going to just flip through them so you can pause on them if you go back and look at the video or if you visit the slides themselves. So he had Financescape, Mediascape, Ideascape, Technoscape, Ethnoscape. He has all these different things, these different aspects of our lives and how our lives are mediated through these things and globalization. So, and so Appadurai, all the way back in 2000, had already kind of mapped out how we can treat virtual worlds and virtual communities like the men's rights activists and incels. Like if I were in class, if we were in person in class, I'd talk more about it. Climate change and climate change denial. One of my grad students has one of her projects on pro-anorexia communities, which is a weird thing I had never heard of before her thesis, but apparently there's a whole network of people globally that meet up online and they're in favor of anorexia and they don't see anything wrong with it, and they're tired of being stigmatized for having anorexia and eating disorders and things. So Second Life is one that you're reading about here. Anti-democracy movements, the far right-wing movements, the intellectual dark web, people, these ideas that keep bubbling up recently are being fueled by academics who are shunned by their universities because their ideas are not considered valid by any academic discipline. But now they have a platform, right? They have these platforms, and eventually they always make their ways to these popular podcasts like Joe Rogan and things. And because they have a PhD, they kind of popularize these ideas that academics have already shot down and punched all these holes in. But if you can find a platform and make your way to Joe Rogan's podcast or make your way to some other talk show host that has a big audience, then people start to, because you have that PhD from an academic institution, these old ideas like eugenics, even like some of the things that we had totally rejected before, social biology, like another completely rejected idea in academia, this idea that men and women are fundamentally different. It's encoded in our genes, and that women are designed to have babies and men are designed to hunt. And so all these ideas that none of this stuff is flexible, it's basically the opposite of cultural constructionism. They're finding these places online, like to legitimize themselves again, right? And so, and it's feeding a lot of these anti-democracy movements as well. So a lot of these ideas that we thought we had defeated in World War II are starting to make a comeback just because of the online virtual communities that they can kind of retrench themselves in. Human trafficking, like trafficking in actual human bodies for the sex trade or, for drugs and things like that. So, right, went backwards actually. Okay. So, all right. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to show the slide for those watching the film. So you can stop on this. You can stop on this slide and kind of see these quotes here. He has an interesting chapter on personhood that I give you about, so how are these technologies changing personhood? Well, you're going to see things in his book, and you're also going to see things in the film. There's the guy who plays Second Life as a 12-year-old girl, and his girlfriend can't understand why he does this. he doesn't really understand why he does it, but later you find out a little bit more about him. He starts to open up, and it kind of makes sense. But even that, it's still, there's still a little fuzziness about why he does that and why he takes it so seriously, right? And why there's a whole community of people that do that. And so for him, for Belsdorff, the body, he refers back to Foucault, like the body is our most ancient and reliable instrument. So our oldest piece of technology is our body. And it's where power is exercised through discipline and constructed through discourse and practice. And so it's a made thing. It can be understood as a technology, as a tool. So, so how do these virtual worlds affect our bodies? And so the mediated virtual body and Second Life, as well as the natural real body, are both products of the age of technique. So again, even our actual bodies can be understood theoretically as something that's made, right? We make the body by talking about it. Emily Martin's article about the egg and the sperm talks about how gender bodies are made in these different areas of discourse. That was as students were learning about conception, they were also learning about maleness and femaleness, these gender symbols, and so in that way, it is a made technology, right? How you use your body. There's no owner's manual for the human body. We pick it up through being socialized, right? And so. Or through enculturation, right? So we pick up the user manual for the human body as kind of something you acquire through enculturation. And it's different in different places and at different historical moments. So, so again, it's something that's made. And so he argues that it, okay, so this continuity between real and virtual bodies doesn't mean that they are the same. He argues that it destabilizes the human as a whole. So it's not making the post-human just more flexible, contradictory, ironic. So he makes this argument in this personhood chapter that, he looks at people when he's doing his field work. They're disabled people who cannot be disabled in virtual worlds, or they do take on disabled aspects in the virtual world. Sometimes people will combine. You can have multiple people controlling the same avatar, or you can have one person controlling multiple avatars. Disabled people, there's a whole controversy that he talks about at Second Life in the book. He talks about how, there are disabled people who kind of, they wanted to make smoother video in the game and have real time. They wanted the audio to improve and make it more lifelike. But there were some disabled people who rejected that and said, like, I don't want people to hear what my actual voice sounds like. And so they didn't want smoother video. They like text chat more, right? And there are people who felt the opposite. I don't want text chat because that's difficult for me to do. I'd rather just talk. So, trans people can be, one of his research participants said that, I can be who I felt like I already was. And so Pavia, a person in the book, started coming out in the real world. I became her, she became me. So this virtual space gave that person a place to practice, to kind of, warm up before they came out in the real world or something. So, and then again, people with autism, Asperger's, people with different social barriers, they can be eased through technology, enabling new modes of personhood online. So again, and so what he talks about is how what they can do online bleeds into what they do offline. And so they kind of play back and forth with each other. And so I'm going to stop there. If y'all have any comments or questions, it's a lot to go through. This book is not easy to read, but his argument is fairly clear. And so that's what I try to do with these slides, is just try to just trying to walk you through his argument. And there's some things that I left out here just to make it shorter, but it's a pretty powerful statement, even though Second Life is not really a thing anymore, but there's a million things like it now. So, kids play Roblox. There's still a few people in Second Life. I'm always looking at what's happening in the world of virtual reality, and there's multiple platforms that are basically just trying to recreate Second Life so that you can do it virtually. I'm going to stop there, and this video will be available on this video will be available on Beachboard later this afternoon. I'll post it. I'll post it on YouTube and then post a link on Beachboard, so you can pause and see some of those quotes, some of the longer quotes. But I definitely think it's worth a read. A lot of students in this class really get into this book, and they end up writing final papers about it because they themselves participate in a virtual world. You could even write a book, if you're doing, I've heard that Animal Crossing is becoming really popular right now. If you are a serious person about Animal Crossing, you could apply some of these ideas to that because everyone's isolated and at home. Some people have become more interested in virtual worlds. So, all right. So I'm going over my own self-imposed time limit. So, I will grade your papers this week. I have more ability to do that kind of thing now, so it won't take forever like last time. Plus, I know midterm 3 is coming up pretty soon because we're damn near the end of the semester. So, we will discuss some of those things next class on Wednesday. Let me look at. I'm still sharing my screen, so I'm gonna pull up the. Where is it? Bounce. Okay, so I'm going to pull up the syllabus here if I can got it open. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is the syllabus. Next class. So this is where we were today. Virtual community. So then today was supposed to be watch the film. So definitely go ahead and watch the film, and then on Wednesday, by Wednesday, you'll have your grades for midterm 2, and I'll go ahead and give you the topics for midterm 3. So yeah, that's a fast turnaround, but I'll have your grades out. Something to think about, for this class and for other classes, and I'm going to email all the anthro majors about this anyway. They sent out that really complicated no credit policy for this semester that they're doing special just for this semester. Something to keep in mind is that you have until May 25th to decide whether or not you want a grade for this class or do you want no credit. So what that means is you will see your final grades before you decide if you want no credit. So that's weird. They're only doing it for this semester. So I'll give you a whole rubric for how to decide. Like if you have a really high GPA like 4.0 and you made a B in this class, you might want to go with credit because if you get credit for a class, it doesn't affect your GPA at all. If you get no credit, it does not affect your GPA. So if you make an F, you definitely want to tell me, you definitely want no credit, right? So because no credit is better than an F because it won't pull your GPA down. So if you're struggling GPA wise and you're near the bottom, and you don't want to drop below a certain grade point GPA, then yeah, take a no credit. You can repeat that. That does stay on your transcript, but you can repeat the class and pass it, later. If you make a C, there's a whole thing. I'll send out a chart about that, about how to help with that decision. But the cool thing about it is you can decide even after 2 years from now, you can contact me and say, hey, could you change this? I need my transcript for so-and-so, and they don't like that I have credit for this really important class in anthro or something like that. So you can even a year from now, you can go back and retroactively change your C to a credit or change an F to change a D to a no credit or something like that. So, okay, so I know there's a lot of confusion out there, so I just wanted to mention that. So go ahead and watch Life 2.0, and we'll talk about that. And then I'll just go over on Wednesday. I'll just discuss the midterm topics with you. I'll talk about the film for about 15 minutes, and then we'll talk about midterm 3. So, all right. So I'll see y'all later. Stay safe. And let me know if you need anything. If you have any questions or anything like that. And I'll see y'all on Wednesday. Watch the movie. It's not a great documentary, but it's entertaining at least. And it'll make you more interested in Belzdorf's book if you watch it. Like I said, it's not the greatest. It's from Oprah's network. It's one of Oprah's documentaries. And so it's fairly well made. It's not the most exciting topic in the world, but I think they make it interesting enough. So, okay. So I'll see y'all next time. I'm going to go ahead and log off. Getting a barrage of emails right now. So, all right. I'll see y'all later. I'll see you Wednesday. Email me if you have any questions, or stick around now. Does anyone raise your hand right now if you need anything? If you have any questions. Nope. Okay. See you. Stop recording.